She said it half a second before I did. Not simultaneously, she got there first, which I've thought about since, in the way you think about small things that turn out to be the whole story. I think you might be, and then I finished it, my new boss. The restaurant continued around us. A waiter crossed the room with 2 plates. Someone at the table behind us laughed at something. The candle between us kept doing what candles do. Neither of us reached for the check. "When do you start?" she said. "Monday," I said. She picked up her wine glass. She didn't drink from it. She just held it, looking at the middle distance, with the expression of someone who has received a piece of information and is running it forward and back to check what it changes. "Sophie!" she said. "Not to me!" To the space above the table, or to the concept of Sophie, or to the particular kind of well-intentioned chaos that follows Sophie wherever she goes. Sophie, I agreed, and that was the moment where a reasonable person would have called the evening what it was, divided the bill cleanly down the middle, wished each other a professional Monday morning, and left. A reasonable person would have felt the situation clearly, made the sensible call, and spent the cab ride home half regretting it but knowing it was right. We are apparently not reasonable people. We ordered the tiramisu. Let me take you back to the beginning of the evening so you understand what we were working with by the time we figured out who we were. Sophie Crane had been my closest friend since university, the kind of friend who knows your entire history and deploys it without asking, who sends you the flat listing you didn't know you needed, who shows up on a bad Tuesday with specific food and no explanation, who has decided, periodically and without consultation, that she knows exactly who you should meet. Over 15 years I had learned that it was simpler to let Sophie make her introductions and then decide what I thought, rather than argue with the certainty in advance. She texted on a Wednesday, "I know someone. Friday evening. You're going. Not a question." The grammar of someone who has already decided. What she told me, smart, works in comms, just moved into a new role she's excellent at, good taste in restaurants, will probably make you feel slightly outpaced in a way you'll enjoy. She said it without irony. I took it in good faith. What she didn't tell me was that the person she was describing was Lena Vasquez, newly appointed head of strategy at Callaway & Prentice, which was the firm I was joining on Monday, in the role of senior strategist, reporting directly to the head of strategy. Sophie's defense later was that she'd known Lena worked in comms, had known she'd just taken a head role, but hadn't known the specific firm. This was true. It was also the kind of true that doesn't make the situation feel less extraordinary. I arrived at the restaurant 7 minutes early, which is how I handle nerves. I had a table near the window and a glass of sparkling water and about 4 minutes to notice things before she arrived. The restaurant was the kind of place that takes the experience of eating seriously without taking itself seriously. Good light, good sound, the precise noise level at which you can have a real conversation without leaning across the table. Sophie had chosen well. Sophie usually chose well. That was the problem with Sophie. She came in like she'd been there before, which I found out later she hadn't. She simply had the specific confidence of someone who has stopped needing rooms to be familiar before she moves through them. She had dark hair and a coat she'd clearly worn in actual weather, and a way of looking around once, quickly, on arrival that told you she'd assessed the space before she was 3 steps inside it. She found me. She came over. She took off the coat. She sat down. "You're early," she said. 7 minutes, I said. "I'm 3, she said, as if 3 was the appropriate response to 7, and it was. And that was the first moment I thought, this is going to be interesting. We ordered. We started talking. And I want you to understand that started talking is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because what actually happened was that we began a conversation and it immediately went somewhere real, which is rarer than it sounds and feels completely different from the ordinary version. She didn't ask what I did and wait for me to ask what she did. She asked a question that assumed we were both already several exchanges deeper than we were, which forced me to actually be there rather than to perform being there. I matched it. She noticed that I matched it and asked a harder question. I noticed that she'd noticed. And somewhere in that first 10 minutes we both understood that the evening had a different quality from expected, and made, without discussing it, the decision to stop being cautious with it. By the time we ordered food, I had stopped cataloging what I noticed about her, and had simply started being in the conversation, which is the only way to have the kind of conversation that matters. We talked about the work we did and the way people who actually care about their work talk about it, not resume language, not accomplishment cataloging, but the texture of it. What problems were actually hard and why? What the industry got wrong that everyone had agreed to pretend it got right? What it felt like to be in the middle of something and not know yet whether it was going to work. This kind of conversation is its own diagnostic. You learn more about a person in 45 minutes of this than in 4 months of the other kind. By the time the main course arrived, I was in the specific situation of finding someone genuinely, inconveniently excellent at precisely the moment when I had no room in my life for the complication of an excellent person. I had just started a new role. I had a first day on Monday that I needed to arrive at with a clear head and a clean slate. I did not need to also be thinking about a person I'd met for dinner, their particular way of asking questions, and the unsettling awareness that I could already tell exactly when they were about to say something true versus something polite. And yet, there it was. We talked about the city the way you do when you're actually in it rather than just passing through. What neighborhoods had changed and in what direction. What the change meant about who the city was deciding to be, whether this was grievable or simply true. We talked about what it felt like to be genuinely good at something and whether being good at it was supposed to feel like it felt, which was often more bewildering than satisfying. She said, "I thought competence would feel like solid ground, and it mostly just feels like standing on something that requires maintenance." I said, "Exactly that." She looked at me like I'd said something she'd been waiting to hear someone say. That was around the time I started to understand that the evening was not going to be what I'd expected it to be, and then we figured out why, exactly, there was no room. It was a client account that gave it away. She'd mentioned an account she was inheriting, complicated, she said diplomatically, that she was going to need to approach carefully. Something about the way she described it, the sector, the history, the specific texture of the complication, matched something that had come up in my final interview, a thorny account that the incoming strategist would need to navigate. A challenge they'd been candid about because they wanted someone who wasn't going to be surprised by it on day one. The incoming strategist was me. I named the firm where I was starting. She went still in the particular way of someone who has just heard something significant and is deciding whether to say the next thing. She named the department, I confirmed it. She set down her fork. "I'm the new head of strategy," she said. Directly. In the way I had already observed, she said most things. No softening. No performative surprise, just the fact. There was a pause during which the restaurant continued to be cheerful and indifferent around us. "I'm joining your team on Monday," I said. She looked at the table, then at me, then at the table again. The way you look at something when you're recalibrating and need a moment to let the recalibration finish. "Sophie," she said. "Sophie," I said. I watched her face go through several things quickly. Not panic, something more considered. The processing of someone who has learned, probably through practice, to assess situations before she reacts to them. She was, I had already understood, someone who assessed things carefully and then moved with full commitment once she'd assessed them. I had already registered one of a number of things about her that I found genuinely remarkable. "We could call it a night," she said. She said it evenly without heat, laying it on the table as the rational option. "We could," I said. "HR has a fraternization policy," she said. "I know it well. I sat on the committee that reviewed it 18 months ago. That sounds like either a reason to leave or a reason to stay, depending on how you read it." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "We came to dinner. We didn't know. We haven't done anything wrong." She picked up her fork. "The tiramisu is apparently very good here," Sophie told me. Sophie told me the same thing. We ordered the tiramisu. We stayed. Here is what it is like to have dinner with someone once you both know that the dinner is also a decision you're making in real time, and neither of you is pretending otherwise. You don't talk about the decision directly. You talk around it, through it, in the space adjacent to it, and the conversation has a different quality, charged in a way that isn't quite flirtation, and isn't quite strategy, and is something more honest than either. You are both aware that what you say will be the information the other person uses to understand what kind of person you are, which means you say things more carefully and also, paradoxically, more truly, because the filter of social performance stops being useful when the stakes are this specific. She had come to strategy from journalism, 4 years as an investigative reporter before moving into communications and then consultancy. The journalism explained everything about her, the way she listened, which was with her whole self rather than the part of her attention that was being polite. The way she was interested in actual motivations rather than stated ones, in the gap between what a thing was presented as and what it actually was. The way a question in her hands became an instrument of genuine inquiry rather than a conversational courtesy. She had spent 4 years professionally caring whether things were true. It had become structural. She had been at Callaway and Prentice 3 years, 6 months in the head role, promoted from senior director when the previous head left for a competitor. She spoke about the promotion with specific, unperformative pride, the kind that comes from knowing you've earned something rather than received it. She wasn't performing confidence, she was reporting it. There is a difference, and it is always apparent, and it was apparent here. We talked about how we'd each arrived where we'd arrived, the actual paths, not the resume version. This is always the conversation that reveals the most, because nobody can narrate their own history without showing what they think matters, and what you think matters is the truest thing about you. She had left journalism because she'd found herself more interested in the strategy of how stories were told than in the telling itself, which had taken her 3 years to admit and 1 week to act on once she'd admitted it. I had left my previous firm because the culture had rewarded the appearance of confidence more than actual judgment, and I had spent 2 years getting better at the appearance and losing ground on the judgment, and had eventually decided I couldn't do both simultaneously. She nodded at that in the way you nod when someone has described something you know from the inside. At some point near the end of the evening, she set down her glass and said, "I want to say something. Hear it as information rather than a speech." "All right," I said. "What happens Monday is what it is," she said. "You're joining a team, I'm leading it. I'm going to be an excellent manager and you're going to do excellent work. And those 2 things are both true and both entirely separate from this evening." She looked at me steadily. "What this evening is, I don't know yet. But I don't want to pretend it wasn't something, because that would be dishonest, and I don't do dishonest well." "Neither do I," said. "Then we'll figure out what it is, carefully, with actual conversation, rather than just hoping the other person draws the same conclusion." I said, "Is this how you run all your strategy sessions?" She said, "Only the important ones. We split the bill exactly down the middle. Neither of us suggested otherwise. We both understood that how the bill was handled was itself a statement, that we were going to be honest about what this situation was, rather than use the conventions of a date to make it look simpler." She took a cab, I walked home. It was cold. I put my hands in my pockets and walked and thought about the evening in the particular way you think about something when you're not yet ready to analyze it but can't quite stop processing it. What it had been was the best conversation I'd had in a very long time, followed immediately by the most complicated situation I'd encountered in a very long time, and those 2 things were inseparable in a way I was going to have to figure out what to do with. I thought about her picking up the fork, the specific smallness of that gesture, the fact that she'd done it without discussion or announcement, had simply looked at the situation and made a decision and proceeded. I thought about how much of what happened in the following weeks and months began at that precise moment. Fork lifted. Dessert ordered. Evening continued. How a choice that looks like almost nothing can be the pivot on which the whole story turns. At some point during the walk, I realized I was smiling in the particular way you smile when something is going to be complicated and you find, to your own mild surprise, that you don't mind the complication at all. I texted Sophie at 10:30. "You could have mentioned the Callaway connection." She replied at 11. "What Callaway connection?" At 11:20, after the explanation, Oh, I genuinely didn't know she was at Callaway. I knew she was in comms. I didn't ask exactly where. I'm so sorry. Are you furious?" I was not furious. I told her I was not furious. What I did, after reassuring Sophie, was sit with the chain of it. Sophie had met Lena through a charity board, an arts funding organization that Sophie had joined 18 months ago and had mentioned, in passing, as one of those commitments that turned out to be more worthwhile than expected. Sophie had described another person from that board, a man she'd characterized as incredibly well-connected and a bit slick, who'd introduced her to several people there, including, it now appeared, Lena. His name was Marcus Hale. I knew the name. Marcus Hale, deputy director at Callaway and Prentice, 7 years at the firm. He had come up in my final interview with the particular careful neutrality you use for someone you are neither praising nor criticizing, the neutrality that tells you more than either praise or criticism would. I had filed him as someone to understand before forming a view. Now I was forming a view. What I did not yet know was whether the chain, Marcus to Sophie, Sophie to Lena, Lena to me, was coincidence or architecture. Whether Marcus had introduced Sophie to Lena casually, in the ordinary way of someone who is well-connected and sociable, or whether he had been, in some way, building something. I didn't have enough information to know, but I had enough to file the shape of it and to understand that if Marcus knew about the dinner, which the anonymous complaint suggested he did, then someone had been paying attention to a chain of connections that I hadn't known to notice. I sat with that for a while. I thought about coincidence and about the alternative to coincidence. I thought about a man who had been at a firm for 7 years and had been passed over for a role he'd spent years positioning for, and about what that man might have thought when he saw the person who'd gotten the role instead, beginning a Friday evening with a new hire. At 11:40, Lena texted, "I've been thinking, we should talk before Monday, not about work." A pause. That sounded more serious than I intended. I meant coffee. "Tomorrow morning?" I said yes. We met at a coffee place near the river. Her suggestion, neutral ground, the right register for what we were doing. She was there before me and was reading her phone when I arrived and looked up when I came through the door, and there was a moment, brief but real, where we both acknowledged silently that whatever this was, it had survived the night and was still itself this morning. We sat down. We ordered. We were 2 sentences into a conversation that was both comfortable and slightly electric with things unsaid, and her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, just a small tightening, the face of someone receiving information they'd been half expecting and half hoping not to receive. She answered. Said yes, said when, said how did they already, and stopped herself, said all right, I'll call you back in 10 minutes. Hung up. She set the phone down on the table. She looked at me. That was a colleague, she said. Someone filed a report to the senior partners last night, a potential HR policy concern. She was very calm. The specific calm of someone who has been managing difficult situations for long enough that she's stopped spending energy on the shock of them. They flagged that I had dinner with a new direct report the evening before his first day. Someone reported us, I said, before we'd had any conversation about what Friday even was. She looked at her coffee. The partners have a standing meeting Monday morning. My colleague thinks it'll be on the agenda. Do you know who? The report was anonymous. She paused. But my colleague recognized the filing approach, the specific policy section cited, the way the complaint was structured. She's seen it before. Another pause. Marcus Hale. I thought about the charity board. I thought about the chain of introductions. I thought about how a man who had been at a firm for 7 years passed over for a promotion after positioning himself as the obvious candidate would think about the woman who'd gotten the role instead. I thought about how much easier his position would be if that woman's tenure became untenable before it properly started. He knew about the date, I said. Apparently he's been paying attention to more than I realized, she said. He moved last night, before we'd made any decision. Which means he wasn't responding to a mistake, he was trying to manufacture one. She told me the full picture over the rest of the coffee, and then over a walk along the river that neither of us had planned, because the full picture needed space and movement to absorb properly. Marcus had wanted the head of strategy role. He had been the internal candidate, the expected one, the person the firm's conventional logic would have promoted. 7 years at the firm, strong client relationships. He had positioned himself, carefully and over time, as the natural next step. When the partners gave it to Lena instead, someone newer, someone brought in specifically because the partners wanted a different approach, he had accepted the decision gracefully, professionally, with the specific grace that signals the response has been redirected rather than abandoned. In the 6 months since, he had been watching. Maintaining his senior partner relationships, making himself available and collegial in ways that kept him in rooms while generating no evidence of animus. He understood, she said, that the move that removes a rival is only effective if it appears to come from somewhere else, from principle, from policy, from concern. He was patient. He had done this before. She described his method in the clinical language of someone who had spent time studying it. He worked through observation and timing, not confrontation. He filed things, he noted things. He waited for the moment when a fact could be presented as a concern as a policy violation as something the firm had an obligation to address. He had been at this long enough to know that institutions, when presented with a neat, policy-compliant problem, prefer to solve the problem rather than examine whether the problem was created. And there had been a previous incident, before Lena, before any of this. A senior strategist who'd been at the firm during Marcus's tenure leading a team, she and a junior colleague had been reported for an HR policy violation. The junior colleague was new, 3 months in. He'd been let go. The senior strategist had transferred and then left 6 months after that. Marcus's team had absorbed the accounts. The reports in that case were anonymous too, Lena said. She was looking at the water. Nobody connected them to Marcus at the time. Nobody had reason to look. She paused. He'd done it before. The configurations were different. The result was the same. I stopped walking. She turned to look at me. Her expression was that particular combination of clarity and tiredness that comes from fully understanding a situation you'd rather not be in. He moved last night, I said, before we'd decided anything, before either of us had done anything except stay at a table and order dessert. Yes, which means the mistake he's reporting is us not leaving, yes. And his assumption is that by the time we could organize a response, the partners would have already received his version. That's my read of it. She looked at the river. We have the weekend. The meeting is Monday at 9. I thought about what we had. A dinner that had been innocent at the start and complicated at the end. A choice we'd made to stay. A chain of introductions that led back to the man who was now filing against us. And somewhere behind all of it, a previous incident that nobody had properly examined. We work fast, I said. She looked at me. You say that a lot. It keeps applying, I said. I will give you the shape of the next 30 hours rather than every detail, because the mechanics matter less than what the mechanics revealed. What I can tell you is that 30 hours of work, when both people doing it understand exactly what is at stake and are moving toward a specific deadline, feels different from ordinary work. It has a quality of clarity. Every conversation is purposeful. Every piece of information either matters or it doesn't, and you know immediately which, and you don't waste time on the ones that don't. Lena worked her network, the people she trusted at the firm, the people who had been there long enough to know where things were archived and what the archives meant, and one person outside the firm who had been in the industry for 20 years and knew where the bodies were in the specific and metaphorical sense. She worked carefully, without broadcasting what she was building, because the value of what they were building depended on it remaining unannounced until it was complete. I called an employment law contact and asked a specific question. If a person files a complaint under a policy they themselves have previously violated, and that previous violation was handled differently, less severely, minimized, never formally addressed, what is the legal exposure for the institution from the inconsistency? The answer was considerable. Inconsistent enforcement of a fraternization policy, particularly where the inconsistency correlates with the identity or seniority of the people involved, is the kind of exposure that makes employment lawyers at large firms deeply unhappy. It suggests selective enforcement. It suggests something worse than an accident. What I found, through publicly available records, a corporate filing Lena's contact recovered from an archived HR summary, and 2 phone calls Lena made to people who had been at the firm during the previous incident, was a thread. Not a confession, a traceable thread. The anonymous complaints in the earlier case had been filed through an internal reporting portal. That portal logged submission metadata, device identifiers, account registration. The device that had filed 3 of the 4 complaints in the earlier case was registered to a firm account. The account belonged to Marcus Hale. Nobody had cross-referenced it at the time because nobody had looked at Marcus. The complaints had come in anonymously and been processed as anonymous complaints, and nobody had thought to ask who had filed them because the complaints had produced the desired result. The junior colleague let go, the senior strategist transferred, the accounts redistributed, and once a problem has produced a result, institutions stop looking at the problem. They had stopped looking. The data had simply sat there, in a metadata log for 3 years, undisturbed, until we looked. On Sunday evening, Lena called the senior partner she trusted most. She outlined what she was bringing. She asked for 15 minutes before the Monday meeting. She got the 15 minutes without hesitation, which told her something about the partner and about where the partner's own comfort with this situation actually sat. I was not in the room when she presented it. I was in the lobby of Callaway & Prentice at 9:05 on my first day, which was not how I had imagined my first day. I was watching the lift doors open and close and thinking about a Friday evening and a choice made over tiramisu and whether the choice had been right. I believed it had been. I still believe it had been. But belief is easier before you know the outcome. She came out at 9:23, walked across the lobby, sat down next to me, said nothing for a moment. Then the complaint is tabled, pending a review of previous enforcement actions. Which means it goes nowhere while they examine what Marcus filed compared to what happened 3 years ago. And while they examine the inconsistency, his position becomes very uncomfortable. She looked at the lobby ceiling. He filed a complaint under a policy he violated. The violation is now on the record. He'd spent 2 years waiting for a mistake from me. The mistake was his. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the previous strategist. The junior colleague let go after 3 months. The woman who'd transferred and left. The accounts redistributed to Marcus's team. What about before? I said. The people from 3 years ago. The partners will review that case as part of the enforcement review, she said. What happens from there isn't ours to control. She paused. But it's on the record now. It can't be unlooked at. She stood up, straightened her jacket, looked at me with the same full attention she'd had across the table on Friday. The assessing look, but different now, clearer of the question it was asking. For what it's worth, she said, I don't regret Friday. Neither do I said. Good. She turned toward the corridor, then without turning back. Your first brief is Thursday. I'll send the background reading today. I watched her go. I thought about the choice we'd made, the specific moment of picking up a fork instead of reaching for the check, and how you can make the right choice before you know it was right, and only understand it afterward from the shape of what followed. I went to onboarding. Monday was strange. I had expected it to feel strange, and it did, but not in the way I'd feared. The strangeness was not awkwardness, it was the strangeness of being in a situation with more layers than the surface showed, of knowing things that the people around me didn't know, of managing a professional interaction with someone who I had spent a Friday evening with and a full weekend working beside, and who I now watched run a team meeting with the ease of someone who is entirely in their element, and thinking, yes, this is exactly who she is. Of course it is. She was good. I want to say that clearly, because it matters to the story. She was excellent at the job, and her excellence was completely independent of anything else. And that independence was itself a kind of integrity I found I respected more than almost anything. She ran the meeting and asked the right questions, and pushed back on 2 assumptions that deserved pushing back on, and gave clear direction on 3 things that needed clear direction. And nobody in the room was performing their engagement with what she was saying, because the engagement was genuine, because she was worth engaging with. I submitted a first draft of something by Wednesday. Her feedback came back the same evening. 4 lines, precise, without softening or inflation, the kind of feedback that respects the recipient enough to be direct about what wasn't working and why. It was better feedback than I had received in 2 years at my previous firm. I sent a revision and a question. She answered the question in the team meeting the following day, in the context of the full group, without singling me out, which was exactly the right call, and I noticed that she'd made it. We were professional. We were also, in the spaces around the professional, careful with each other in a different way, the kind of careful that is itself a language, that says, I know what this is, I haven't forgotten what this is, and I am going to handle it seriously. The formal declaration, the HR documentation, the disclosure that went into both our files, the conversation with the managing partner that Lena initiated before I started my 3rd week, was not romantic. It was, as she described it, the foundation we were building on, and foundations are not supposed to be romantic, they are supposed to be solid. We built it solid. We built it in the open. We built it so that it could not later be presented as something hidden or opportunistic, because the one thing we had agreed on, that first Friday evening at the table, was that we didn't do dishonest well. Marcus Hale left Callaway and Prentice in February. He didn't announce it and the firm didn't announce it. One day he was simply no longer there. The way people sometimes leave when leaving is the better alternative to what stays visible if they remain. His accounts were redistributed across the team. His name came up in fewer conversations each week, until it came up in none. That is the specific way institutions absorb the departure of someone who had been part of them for a long time. They close around the absence and continue, and within a few months the closing is complete, and it becomes difficult to remember exactly what the shape of things was before. I thought about the woman who had left the industry entirely, 3 years before, when there was nobody to file a counter, and nobody to build a thread, and nowhere for the thread to go. I thought about her sometimes. She asked me once, months later, when the construction had become simply how we were, when the careful management of it had relaxed into something natural, whether I'd seriously considered leaving on Friday. Yes, I said, for about 30 seconds. What stopped you? I thought about it. You picked up your fork, I said, before either of us said another word. You looked at the situation and you picked up your fork, and I thought, this is someone who decides things by going further into them rather than retreating, and I didn't want to be the person who retreated from something she'd decided to stay in. She looked at me. I picked up my fork because the tiramisu looked good. That may also be true, I said. She laughed. The whole face laugh, the one she'd been doing since that first Friday, and had eventually stopped pulling back on. You know what I thought? She said. When you said the firm's name. When I understood. I thought, of course. Of course it's complicated. Because nothing about this evening had been simple since the moment I sat down, and the question was never whether it was complicated. The question was whether what was at the other end of the complication was worth it. Was it? I said. She looked at me for a moment. You're asking me that now? I'm asking you now, I said. Yes, she said simply. Obviously yes. The thing I've thought about most, the thing that stays with me, that I keep returning to, is that we made the choice before we had any of the information, before Marcus, before the partners' meeting, before 30 hours of weekend work, before any of it. We made the choice at a table on a Friday evening on nothing more than a sense, this is something. This is worth staying for, and the sense turned out to be right, and the cost of the choice turned out to be something we could meet, and none of that was knowable in the moment we made it. There was no way to know. There was only the choice. Sometimes the choice is the whole thing. We stayed. We dealt with what staying cost. We built something worth the dealing. I don't know that I would have done it differently. I know that I would not. Have you ever made a decision at the exact moment it would have been reasonable to leave? Not because you knew it would work out, but because something in you was completely certain the complication was worth more than the safety of the exit. And have you ever met someone mid-conversation and felt the specific frustration of finding the right person at the wrong time, and then decided, not wisely, not carefully, just honestly, that you weren't going to let the timing be the reason you didn't try? Leave your answer below. Someone needs to read what you're about to write. Subscribe and don't miss what comes next.